tend to talk a lot, so I'll just make a start before I get the presentation up. Thank you very much. Is that low enough? Can everybody hear me okay? Is that okay? Thank you very much. It's down here. Oh. No, it's not working here. I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the definitions behind sustainability and how organisations are responding to this global drive, and how I've actually been working with companies over the past 10 years, in predominantly the construction sector, to embrace sustainable principles into their business operations, and then I'm going to look at some case studies of some buildings. Thank you very much. So I'll just kind of flick through. And the four areas that I'm going to look at with businesses embedding sustainability are actually the four areas defined by the UK Sustainable Development Strategy. So a lot of people understand sustainability by three-pillar approach: the social, economic and the environmental pillars. And really the UN definition was the kind of global stamp, if you like, of sustainability. And really it's about living in a way today that doesn't jeopardise future generations to have the same standard and quality of living that we're enjoying today. So, and you look at other studies like the WWF and climate change predictions and the way we're living, all these anthropogenic causes, the way man is living predominantly in the West, we're having a really knock-on, unsustainable influence on the planet. So if everyone in the world lived according to the way we do, we would need 3 planets. And of course we only have the one planet, but with other issues like global population rise around the world, other people in particularly developing countries and the BRIC countries, Brazil, the China, the Russia, these new emerging economies, they want to enjoy the same standard of living. So this is all putting added pressure on the planet, and then with that you're getting increased floods, you're getting increased temperature rise, so desertification, all those kind of other environmental issues. So how then does that impact on business or government? And that's why we're seeing these big drivers like the G8 summits and the World Earth Summits actually happening, and big companies making these commitments and targets. So the UK, Ireland are really actually setting the high standard in terms of renewable energy right across the UK and actually part of Western Europe with their energy targets. But they know that they have to adapt. So it's all about mitigating, but also adapting. So that's where you as engineers, the engineering and construction sector, can design really good energy efficient buildings that are going to have a minimum impact on the planet and actually enhance the way of life now, but and enhance future generations as well, because we don't want to compromise on that quality of life. A sustainable building shouldn't compromise in quality. So these are sort of organisations that are responding to these things, and that's the right thing to do. So how does this then relate to the construction sector? Well, alone the construction sector uses 17% of fresh water consumption around the world. And when we think about that in Ireland or the UK, a lot of that fresh water is being treated. It's fit for human consumption, and yet we're maybe just using it in construction to wash down things, or we're flushing it away. So it's not very sustainable, even in terms of the carbon that's used to treat that water. In terms of timber, 25% of the world's global timber is used for construction alone. So that's why we see with Paul mentioning the use of blue-limb timber and sustainable timber supply chain. The WWF also had a study to show that 90% of the timber that is coming into the UK, into London ports, is from unsustainable sources. It cannot be traced. So that's a huge issue. So where do you start governing that? Do you govern that in London? Do you govern it in the ports of South America? Because actually that's where a lot of this deforestation is happening. So when we think about your business in the construction sector and the civil engineering sector here in Ireland, it's not just about Ireland, but it's the knock-on effects of the supply chain. Where's the timber coming from? Where are these materials coming from? And what sort of legislation and policies are in place to ensure sustainability is considered? And obviously we all know the statistics about CO2 emissions, whether it's from transport, but actually all processes to do with construction are accountable for 50% of CO2 emissions. Mostly that's inefficient use of buildings. really badly designed buildings, not obviously by the likes of Paul here with the Passive House, but very unsustainable buildings. So that's why actually we're seeing a drive that even though the construction sector's gone down the last few years, there is a surge in new builds or refurb, because these unsustainable buildings are actually costing our governments and our economies a lot of money, and they will be hit on the international markets, they will be fined. And it does contribute to the global economy, so it's not all bad. We think, oh my goodness, construction's very bad and let's just stop building. It does contribute to the economy, and the largest issue is that around waste. So I'm not going to go on about that, but 1/3 of waste in our landfill site is from construction materials alone, and I think there's some statistics that show that even up to 60-70% of that is not even used, it's just damaged. So good housekeeping on sites and things like that are needed. I'll maybe fly through that, but just again looking at in terms of carbon, and you can see actually the very last point there that the majority of carbon used in a building is not necessarily upfront or the embodied, but it's actually during the building's operation and maintenance. So I'll speak a wee bit about the case study I was involved in, and actually the further research. I think Paul mentioned, I think your question to Paul was about actually how is that building performing. So you can have all these designs, a designer can build an energy efficient building, the construction company can come along and build it in a very sustainable way with sustainable materials. But when you hand that over and the users aren't using it sustainably, well, is it still a sustainable building? Well, yes, it's been designed that way, but it's not being used sustainably. So there's a lot of work to be done with post handover, post occupancy. So think of waste, water, materials, and biodiversity and green space. So what have I been doing then with organisations, as I mentioned, these 4 areas? So simple things. So we look first of all at sustainable consumption production and what they're using. So the goods in. So simple things like making sure the timber is from sustainable forests. So this is why you're getting these stamps. And this actually also ensures that the money is going back into local economies, whether it's the EU or the UK. And again, we think about economic sustainability as well. So these are some of the certification stamps. There's about 5 around the world. This is the Malaysian timber one, and I think they're working on one at the moment with Gabon in Central Africa to come up with a new standard for timber from there. After water, concrete is the most used substance on the planet. So horrible statistic if you actually think about the amount of energy and the carbon that goes into making concrete and cement. So ordinary Portland cement, it's very carbon intensive. So what some companies can do, they can use, I think this is EcoCem, which is based here in Dublin. I'm sure you've all heard of this. And this was used in the Samuel Beckett Bridge and the Dublin Conference Centre. So this was a project I was involved in, the bridge. And so we substituted up to 70% of ordinary Portland cement with EcoCem. So it actually reduces the whole embodied carbon of the structure by about 80%. And that's the Lewis Taney, which also used the same material. And training site operatives and things to conserve and utilise water sustainably and recycle. So in terms of climate change and energy, the second point down there, designing energy efficient buildings. So this is an EPC certificate. Again, we think about BREEAM, using the likes of BREEAM or Passive House standards to actually ensure that buildings at handover are really airtight and have good U values. So using passive design where we can, so using the natural elements, but where the energy demand still exists, then substituting that with really energy efficient or active renewable energy designs. So I'm not going to touch too much on that. And also simple things companies have been able to do with video conferencing, teleconferencing to reduce carbon transport miles. The company I previously worked for was Graham, they had a lot of projects in London, but simple things like this can obviously reduce the carbon associated with travel and transport. So with increased temperatures, climate change predictions, we're going to see more rainfall, floods happening. So SUDS, or sustainable urban drainage, is a really huge issue when it comes to buildings and projects. And this is an example of a SUDS pond. So diverting the water into a kind of swale which actually can act as a natural habitat as well. So it reduces the risk of flooding in the area, and then that can naturally dissipate into the local watercourse, and it's being filtrated. That's okay if you have that space. If you don't have that space, we see things like green roofs, and again, we think of the green space because actually what these roofs can do, this can insulate buildings, so it can help with your heat costs, and also with air quality. So years ago we were designing schools and buildings to be warm because Ireland's so cold. Nowadays and that was the main energy demand. Nowadays the main energy demand in buildings we're seeing is actually cooling, because every single room and every single person has a laptop, a computer and bodies. We're generating heat all the time. And sometimes we can't use the outside temperature, we can't use that natural air from outside because of our air pollution, especially in built up cities. So we need to start thinking about flexibility when it comes to design of buildings. You know, in years to come, will that area be pedestrianised? If we have a lot of green space, if we've got trees there, it'll clean the air. And then we will be able to fit in louvers in time, which will actually cool the building, and it's reducing costs. So the main costs actually with cooling are particularly in server rooms with a lot of companies. So just things to think about. Some more green roofs and other biodiversity actions companies can take. And you can also kind of integrate these with the social side of things and giving back to the community, creating green spaces where maybe you don't have a project like the Lewis Taney Bridge and the other Samuel Beckett Bridge. There wasn't a lot of scope for biodiversity, so we worked with a lot of local schools and eco schools and drivers that way to provide green space for local neighbours. And we see schemes like the Consider It Constructor scheme, so where we would employ local people, we're involving the local communities in areas where we're working, and also upskilling and training people. So this is kind of the social side of sustainability that some people kind of struggle with, and they think, well, why should we take on long-term unemployed people with no qualifications? Well, actually, they're perhaps a drain on the system, on the welfare system, but actually by bringing them back into work, they're paying more tax. They're paying that tax back into your local authority, and they're giving you the contracts to upgrade your road or your school or to build a new hospital. So it's actually very sustainable for your business model to be employing people to take them off welfare state, because that's securing your future projects. And also even thinking about in terms of materials, even fair trade, so your coffee or tea, your sort of commodities that come from the third world, can we ensure there are stamps on things? Now I would love to see fair trade aggregates from China or stone and things like that. At the moment we're not seeing those, and that's why I stick this up, because at the moment it's just things like coffee and tea and drinks. So I'm just going to finally then touch on the flagship building that Graham I was involved in over 6 years ago now. EPC A rate, it was up to BREEAM standard. So at the time of BREEAM, excellent was the highest standard. And it used a lot of this passive design, a lot of things that Paul was talking about. And then where the energy did demand, where it was the demand, we used active. So I'm not going to touch on that. That's the sort of 10 criteria around BREEAM. But even just by orientating the building, so this is where we use a lot of BIM, building information modelling, software and innovations proved really useful. So we were actually able to show that just by shifting the building for southeast facing, you would actually save on 20% of energy costs alone. And then we were able to simulate this with daylight simulation, and we involved a lot of universities. So I believe that sustainability is not just about doing these things, but it's sharing the information and this knowledge. So I was heavily involved in a TSB, Technology Strategy Board study, to actually look at the building in use. So it wasn't just a sustainable building, but actually how was it performing. So I think we were on average getting about a 10% daylight factor. Are there any architects in the room? Paul, is 10% quite a good daylight factor? So, and that's kind of average on 3 floors. So it's very spacious, a lot of light, natural light coming in. And as Paul said, with natural light, you could actually jeopardise the building's ability to keep cool, especially in summer, even in Ireland. So we had a brise soleil, so we basically designed out features that would stop the building overheating in the first place. So this by solar shading, optimising the natural ventilation of a natural passive stack flow. And someone mentioned about phase changing materials. We had a lot of exposed concrete for exposed mass, which actually acts as a thermal sink. You may think that's not very sustainable when it comes to concrete, but we did use the EcoSem there, and with night cooling also helped cool the building during the day. So the building has a series of louvers. There are sensors throughout the building that take readings of temperature and CO2 every 3 seconds. So these series of louvers will open and close as the building management system. It's a 963 Trend Energy Manager, if anyone's interested in the software that was used. And that will then dictate what louvers open. So you're getting this flow of cold air coming in. As it gets warm, passive stack ventilation, it gets released then as hot air through the building. There's actually a heat recovery system as well through the server room. So it hasn't been breathed because no one actually works in the server room. It's very noisy. But it's fresh air, but it's quite temperate as it comes in as cold air. It gets quite warm going around all the computers, and then that's circulated to parts of the building where it would be cold. And I mentioned then the exposed mass, so the heat of the building during the day with computers and people is absorbed in the concrete pillars, the concrete slabs and the roof. And then at night time, that heat is released back into the building when it's cold. So when you come into the building in the morning, it's not a cold building, it's quite temperate. And adversely then in the summertime, when you want the building to be cool during the day, the skylights open at night between 3 and 5 in the morning, allowing all this cold air. It's absorbed in the concrete. Everyone comes into work, and all the cool air then is released through the heat sink of the concrete back into the space. So no cooling and no heating, just purely by using windows. So in terms of, that was the kind of passive design. Now in terms of the active design, lighting controls, motion sensors, T5 lights, Philips lighting, and they actually dim and brighten according to the natural lux light level. So a lot of cost involved up front, but actually when you look at the cost savings, we were saving perhaps 30,000 a year on energy and 45,000 a year compared to previous premises on heat and our heat demand. And these are the control systems throughout the building. And I mentioned heat there, so it's a 240 kilowatt biomass boiler. There also is an oil backup that's used during the summertime. So it uses FSC certified wood pellets. And as I mentioned, that's saving £45,000 on heating a year. So a large silo tank to just transport delivery. So thinking about the embodied transport when it comes to the building. So I'll just touch briefly on SUDS. It was an old contaminated site. It would have been quite costly to remediate all that land or to take it off site and dump it, but we treated it on site. We used 100% of everything. We integrated underground SUD systems to penetrate and allow water to easily disperse through the final building. So reduce the flood risk of the area, which actually increases then the capital investment and what's the word, like the sellability of the building. It becomes more attractive to investors or potential developers in the future. Rainwater harvesting and the use of infrared, so no taps and things. So think of the finishes. Actually, it's a very open plan building and there could be an issue with sound, so we used a lot of this was American oak. When I say American, why are we buying oak from America when we have a market here? Perhaps is it because there aren't any companies here that are supplying these quality materials? But certainly it shows that there is a niche in the market. There's an opportunity to do so. New Zealand wool, again from New Zealand. We think about all our little sheep that we have running around Ireland and Wales closer to home, but yet we're sourcing our wool from New Zealand, and nettle fibre materials as well. So all these kind of act as acoustic walling throughout the building, on chairs and dividers and carpets and things. So carpets are made from recycled content as well, up to 60%. So nice natural fibres, and again you can put corporate colours and things like that on them. Nice feature. Desk spaces are 100% recycled wood chip, and again more cost effective. So transport, biodiversity, use of, we see cycle to work schemes, things like that, shower facilities, cycle rack facilities. Lighting that actually is quite not very bright upward, so it doesn't deter perhaps bats or nocturnal species at the evening times if security lighting is on. So again, working really closely with the architects to make sure it's really energy efficient lighting, but it doesn't have a knock-on effect on even neighbouring biodiversity. There was actually no biodiversity on the site, very low value, but the choice of species that we went for actually attracted a lot of wildlife, so it's a nice little fluffy picture to kind of finish with. And as I mentioned, the 3-year study did repeat airtight tests, so I think the first airtightness test was a 4.63, and then the repeat one 2 years later was 4.2. 4.26, and we had University of Jordanstown actually undertake that with Stroma Engineering, and they reckoned that the building just naturally comes in on itself anyway, and it should be more airtight. But we also flagged up issues with thermal bridging, areas where there were leaks in the building and things perhaps weren't working so well. So it's all about informing, and that's why it's a great opportunity to be here and actually feed this information and knowledge back to people as well. So there is funding out there to collaborate and do a lot of R&D. And I'll just kind of show this slide with the energy consumption. So this was just taken from September. So as you can see, October, November, December, you'd obviously use a lot more energy in the building because it's getting cold. But you can see the green, which is the biomass. That's when the biomass boiler kicks in. So even though there's more energy consumption, when you look at the cost is coming down. It's more cost effective than the oil. So then you can start to make corporate decisions. You can start to make economic decisions as a company and say, well, actually, we'll maybe just use biomass through the year. And then you can obviously look at CO2 emissions, which come down. So thank you, and I'll take any questions. Sorry for rushing through there. Sorry, that particular building is in County Down in Hillsborough. So it was the Hillsborough, it's the Graham Construction head office, just on the A1. It was the old Chimera fertiliser site. So it won British Council for Office Most Sustainable Building UK, won Sustainable Ireland award for Most Sustainable Building, and it won the RICS Most Sustainable Building and Action Renewables Most Sustainable Building. Did it, the SUD system? Oh no, well, we had an attenuation tank at the end of the car park, and then that would just allow the water to actually dissipate. And in fact, on a rainy day, it was really good to demonstrate, because the road outside, you would see the water line on the tar road, but the actual paving system was really dry. No, we didn't have any suds, ponds, or little wildlife habitats for newts or anything nearby, unfortunately. And then, yes, at the back of the building, then that's when we had the rainwater harvesting tank. So it was a hydrophonic system that was used for the rainwater harvesting, which was saving the company about £520 a month. And it was actually a decision that was quite late on. The board thought, well, perhaps we don't need to use rainwater harvesting for toilet flushing. There's not going to be a demand for this. But they went for it anyway. As it's mentioned, it was a flagship building, and I was trying to pull out all the stops environmentally. But once it was up and running, the predictions actually showed, we had the forecast from the rainwater harvesting company, but actually in use that they proved better. So we just couldn't believe the amount of water we're flushing away every day. But this is a big cost to business, and it's drinkable water that we're flushing away. Yes? Well, they're very, I think they're very familiar with BREEAM standards, obviously for public sector. So this was one of the few, I think it's the second building on the private sector side of things that went for this, but we had no issues, perhaps because it was a contaminated site beforehand as well. But as far as I was aware, there were no issues buying the land and kind of securing that. Their targets aren't as good as here in the south, and certainly in Scotland as well. So they're pretty happy for business and industry just to lead the way, and I think that kind of shows the sector where it's heading. If we rely on government and we rely on planning to kind of lead the way, well, they haven't really been leading the way, so they're putting things in place, but I think it's up to businesses to be more proactive on following. Any more questions? Yes, yes.
I'm just interested in the business opportunity for sustainability in construction. So I think it's BAM contractors say that 20% of their turnover is down to green projects. I wonder, do you have a similar insight for ground construction, and just to draw the importance of all this good work and why we need to do it?
Actually, for Graham it was about 90%, and that's really because a lot of the work was for public sector. So actually at the moment all public sector buildings new build have to reach a BREEAM excellent standard, and for a refurb it's a very good, I think it's very good for a refurb. So because if your client is public sector, because as I mentioned the G8 summit and the World Earth Summits, these governments are committed. So Ireland has committed to reaching these targets. The UK is committed. We've seen them fail in the past and they haven't been penalised, and I think those days are gone, and I think it's only going to be a number of years where they will be hit and the fines will come in. So those are the drivers. So green buildings are the way forward, and they make it more sellable, flexibility, all those things, and it's money at the end of the day is going to be the driver. And we think of energy, the whole security side of things and where it's coming from, and conflict and around the world. So there's more pressures, globalised, other issues, political issues are dictating that we need to be more sustainable and rely on our own energy demands.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was fantastic.